about her faith. And so that's one of the core things that we'll talk about as we move progressively into this section about what does it mean for us to work in a democracy where you may have multiple religious views or no religious view, where you may have ideologies about something that some person else agrees with or disagrees with. So we covered refusal of reasonable requests for accommodation arising from a protected characteristic, and that applies only in employment. And we've covered unjustifiable hardships, so we will move on to the next slide. Exceptions. So the legislation only prohibits unfair or unjustifiable discrimination. What we've done in this particular framework is that we've taken a test similar to the constitutional test and expanded it to include a range of factors for an assessment to be made about whether discrimination is justifiable or unjustifiable. So what we will call unfair discrimination. So some of the factors included in this regard are, what's the effect on the person who is being discriminated against or who's alleging discrimination? Are they part of, is this a group that experiences systematic discrimination? One of the key factors that I want to, that we've explicitly included out of the concerns that we've heard is an action taken in order to protect another right or right protected under the Constitution, that balancing exercise. So we're talking about a right to political association, freedom of expression, freedom of religion, and a whole range of rights that an assessment is made about that balancing exercise. Inherent requirements of a job or genuine occupational qualifications. What we know from the case of Maria Roches is that with regards to public authorities, the law is settled. Certain forms of discrimination are restricted in relation to public authorities. Now, there are other circumstances where it may be necessary, it's a genuine occupational qualification for a job to be done by a person from a particular group. So you may have a job that is necessary for a person of a particular faith background or particular ethnicity or particular sex. If we're doing a play, it may be necessary in the interest of artistic authenticity for a particular person of a particular description to be able to do that job. There are times when those characteristics might be irrelevant. And so the legislation provides an exception for inherent requirements of a job or genuine occupational qualifications. And then an important piece of this legislation that is sensitive and responsive to the concerns that we've heard is an exemptions framework. Exemptions frameworks can work in multiple ways. So in the first instance, an exemptions framework says there are particular provisions of this act that my particular concern would wish to be accepted from. And that might be because it is not an arrangement that you're able to comply with at the time. So the National AIDS Commission, for example, is up about 20 stairs. They may say, look, we recognize that it is possible that the way that our services are offered may discriminate against people with disabilities. We're not able to comply because if we have to install an elevator, we will no longer be able to provide the services that we need to. And so an exemption could be registered, which provides a preventative, proactive mechanism so that you know, look, in this regard, I'm not able to comply. Exemptions also may be applied with regard to particular characteristics in particular sectors. Now, of course, this must be consistent with the constitutional protections. And so one of the key things that we have to talk about is the importance of that bit of the Constitution that says everyone is entitled to equal protection of the law. That's not with regard to a particular characteristic. It's a broad provision that every Belizean is entitled to equal protection of the law. And so that flows from that, the exemptions must be consistent with the constitutional guarantee, but it provides a mechanism for flexibility. So we said, for example, that religious institutions, which are public authorities, that discrimination on particular grounds are clearly prohibited under the Constitution. Taxpayers' dollars are involved, and so the state, the ruling in Maria Roches recognized on the basis of fairness that it may be necessary for some limitations to apply. Now, what this exemptions framework and the general exceptions framework may provide is that a private religious educational institution consistent with the constitutional right for religious bodies to have educational institutions, that they may be able to differentiate on particular grounds. So it may matter to a religious educational institution the marital status of a person. It may matter for a religious educational institution the sexual orientation, the gender identity, a whole range of factors may matter for the specific concerns of a religious educational institution. And that's what this exemptions framework is designed to address. What the exemptions framework does is that it provides a mechanism of notice. So it's a procedural, it can be a procedural protection where a person who applies to a job or is going to apply to a job will know in advance this legislation does not apply in this regard. And so you may not be qualified for this position. Now all of this consistent with the constitutional framework. Next step, please. Next slide. So the legislation provides that if you comply with another law, it is not in breach of this legislation. Now, you will see that there is currently a 2-year framework for the continued reviews of laws to ensure that laws are brought into compliance with the requirements under the Constitution for laws to provide equal protection of the law, to provide protection of the law, and to provide for the non-discrimination provision. Now, in the absence of people taking or challenging a particular piece of legislation, frequently laws stay on the book which may be problematic in the absence of challenging laws. Now, we know that litigation is, and as an attorney, I know this, lawyers are not cheap. Lawyers are not cheap. Litigation in our judicial systems in the Caribbean can take forever and a day. And so what this does is that when the commission is established, the commission has the responsibility for reviewing the laws to bring them into conformity with the existing constitutional requirements in the absence of a challenge. And that's important. Now, we spoke about temporary special measures and welfare measures. So an organization may recognize that we've had a set of drownings, and we recognize that a particular group, that there are lower levels of swimmers in that group. So we want to provide on Sundays from 3 to 6 only for those persons to be able to access a swimming pool because we're providing classes only for them. That's a temporary special measure or a welfare measure. So if you may have protective provisions for providing needs of persons who've experienced domestic violence, the legislation says this is a welfare measure, and therefore if there is a home that is only for a particular sex, because of the necessity of engaging with domestic violence, legislation says this is not affected. Fundamentally, and there's a further provision in relation to domestic violence, where an employer is aware of an incident of domestic violence and a worker requires a time off, they may require a change in schedule, they may require a shifted location, subject to the same requirement of unjustifiable hardship, then the legislation asks the employer to consider that request. Because we know that domestic violence is an issue that not only affects the individual, but it affects the community. And then there are other specific exceptions. So insurance. the insurance industry of necessity makes decisions about risk. But it must be that that decision is based on an actuarial justification. What does that mean? That they've crunched the numbers and there is an appropriate business case about that. What we've known from reviewing other legislation, other experiences, is that it is not always based on actuarial justification. Sometimes it is based on stereotypes. So I'll give you an example which is central to the prevention of HIV and cure provisions in the legislation. Do you think people living with HIV can access life insurance in Belize? Yes, they can. Do you think that they should be able to access life insurance? No. Here's the reality of the medicine at this stage. The HIV that you knew about in the 1990s and the 2000s is radically different now because of the treatment that is available. So a person who is diagnosed with HIV at the age of 30, whether married, single, heterosexual, homosexual, etc., can have a full life, 80, 85, because the medication works. We know the medication works, but they cannot access insurance. What are some of the things that we need insurance for? If you want a mortgage, you might need life insurance. And so it's not just a question of being able to access the direct service, it's about how does that limit access to equal opportunities. And so the legislation provides a framework, and we're in conversations with the supervisor of insurance for the supervisor of insurance with the commission to develop a framework that would provide for an appropriate limit for policies that persons living with HIV would be able to access. Now that's something that's going to be set by the industry. So that takes into account the risk, but it recognizes that the nature of the disease has changed. Now we'll come soon to talk about the prevention of HIV and care, but I'll just talk about it here. Because of the prevalence of discrimination and stigma, 50% of persons living with HIV in Belize are not compliant with their medicine regime. So what does this mean? So when you go to the doctor and the doctor tells you if you've got arthritis or you've got a heart condition, you need to take your warfarin, but you feel like you want to take it, the doctor says take it 3 times a day, I think 2 is okay. What that has is that it has a negative effect on the treatment. 50% of persons living with HIV in Belize are not accessing healthcare services, so there's low levels of testing, and then secondly, there's low levels of compliance with the medical regime. Part of that is fear about accessing healthcare services. Part of that is about fears about employment. So all of this component speaks to the importance of addressing these stories of discrimination that limit equal opportunity. Next slide. So I've been really, really careful because I recognize the balance that is required. This has been about striking a balance to ensure that even if a person is of a different faith from you, or that their faith perspective varies. So you may both be within the Christian tradition, but a person sees something slightly different. So for my mom, an Adventist, very, very different views from a Catholic or evangelical. But all faiths, so, and we're not just talking about Christianity, because we have to talk about Muslims, we have to talk about Jews, we have to talk about the broad variety of religions that exist even when they're small groups. So even if it's only 0.1%, Rastafarians, we have to be able to provide broad protections so that we'll come now to talk about this metaphor of the umbrella. Now, if we are all, let's assume that this roof is gone and the state is responsible for providing coverage. As it does, the Constitution, international law says the state has a responsibility to take care of you and a responsibility to take care of you. Cool. But the state only builds the umbrella to cover these two gentlemen here. When we talk about the umbrella, we're talking about their particular faith perspectives, their particular their particular ethnic characteristics. This umbrella stays here, only protects them. So everybody else, if there's torrential rain, you will stay in the rain. Now, if everybody has an umbrella, we're in a small space like this, everybody will be able to shelter. But if we're all in this closed space, we're in this space but there's no roof, all of us might not be able to hold up our umbrellas straight like this. If I'm here and she's there, we might need to shift so that each of us is able to have protection. And so we think about the state as providing a big umbrella or providing umbrellas to protect citizens. Now, what the research, when we looked at all of the data, said was that there are a lot of people who don't have umbrellas. And this legislation fundamentally is therefore about providing umbrellas. And so the balancing exercise that we're concerned with is how do we tilt here and there so that you're able to exercise your convictions, and that person who doesn't agree with this conviction is still able to go to work, still able to go to school, that they're still able to experience the love and wrath of a parent, etc. That's what this legislation is about. So protection of people of all faiths and no faiths. So if you work in a public service and there is something that you disagree with fundamentally, but there's another person who works in that government agency who does not, then you seek an accommodation. This isn't consistent with my beliefs. Can another person do this? So there have been cases where there are high-level ministers across the Caribbean who are people of faith and disagree fundamentally with legislation that has been passed. There are times when they have allowed an acting Governor General to step in because they don't agree with legislation about gambling. But they recognize that for them, I'm not going to go into the casino. But this is the state's business, and the state's business will go on. My personal convictions, I'm not going into the casino. As for me and my family, we are not going into the casino, and it protects their individual right while proceeding with the state's business. So accommodations in that regard. We're coming to questions now. Religious exceptions. So this legislation does not apply to essentially, there is a zone of autonomy, a zone of freeness for religious bodies. So the legislation does not apply to the ordination, training, selection. What happens in service does not apply. The legislation does not apply to any act by a religious body that is consistent with its tenets of belief. And we've been sure to make sure that we protect the right to freedom of expression and therefore the right to freedom of religion. All right, next slide. So we will go back to that slide and we will at this point take some questions. I will call on the moderator. There will be a roving mic and we will be taking your questions, noting your questions, noting your concerns, and the rapporteur is here, so we'll be sure to pay attention to that.
Good night. So, questions and comments? Okay, wonderful. So, okay, sure. So you ended up with the umbrella, and my comment is that I believe our Constitution already provides that umbrella, and that we already have laws on the and that Belize has already signed on to many declarations and conventions that provide the many rights of those who you are identifying with different characteristics and who you suspect might have the possibility of coming under harassment and victimization. So my question to all, especially those who are very familiar with our laws, our constitution, our policies, why aren't we strengthening those that are already in place? Why aren't we investing in those that need greater support and implementation? Why aren't we strengthening our judicial system so that these laws are enforced from north to south? East to west, we all complain, red, blue, white, yellow, and green, that we have these laws, we have these policies, and they are weak and not enforced. So I would love that those who are part of the association, the steering team, that they truly, as you said, let us make sure we look in the next 2 years at what the laws of Belize are before anything like this truly comes on the books. Let us make sure that we are enforcing, that we are addressing those current needs, and make sure that we are prioritizing those that are epidemic and crisis. Alcoholism, diabetes, mental illness, and disabilities from the beginning of time. You clearly and wonderfully expressed yourself as to when we started to have the need to address the issue about AIDS. And I am saying, because I am a mother of a child with a disability, I'm an advocate and an activist for persons with disability, and I am saying, let us go forward with that charge to ensure that those who are continued to be discriminated against, marginalized, and are vulnerable in the society, I need hundreds of millions of dollars, not hundreds of thousands of dollars. Thank you.
I want to thank you for the question. And the area of disability for me is personal. And so we'll start with the adequacy of Belize's legal framework. The Constitution of Belize does not protect against discrimination on the basis of disability. It says there is a value that persons with disabilities should not be discriminated against. So it mentions it in the preamble. It's mentioned in a part of the Constitution that has limited enforceability. So we'll start there with...
Declaration.
We're coming. Please.
Disabilities. I am saying the little that we have, we little nation that we like to say little and little resources and little and little and little, well, let's work with the little and do great.
So, thank you. Just allow me to finish. It's important that I'm able to respond. So, the declarations that we've signed on, when reviewed by the same United Nations, we found that the legal framework is ineffective. And so it's been recognized that we need to have laws in place. There is no right to adjustment in the absence of this bill. It doesn't exist. And so we have to provide that's what we're doing. We're strengthening the legal framework through this bill. Further, one of the things that it does, perhaps above all else, is the establishment of a commission and a tribunal that have broad powers and broad remedies to give effect to that. Because when a person says, I have a child with a disability who cannot access X, I don't know who to go to, I don't know what resources there are, that's what that commission is fundamentally about. And so equal opportunities legislation really seeks to achieve the very goals that I hear you talking about. The declarations, so the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, UN Convention to eliminate discrimination against women, all of them require the government to enact legislation to address the issues that the government has agreed to address. So I will allow CEO to respond and Mr. Shepherd.
Good night. I just want to reinforce what Rashad was saying. Essentially, what the bill is doing is enhancing the provisions of the Constitution. So rightfully, our provisions of the Constitution does not specifically mention disabilities other than in the preamble. And so this is giving us a mechanism to address it. And one of the key points is to understand that trying to get constitutional redress is very difficult. And as he rightfully said earlier, going to the court is time consuming and it is very costly. What this bill is doing is establishing that commission that would allow you another mechanism of seeking redress. If there wasn't this bill, the person would still be able to seek the redress because there is the Constitution. But what this Equal Opportunities Bill is saying, you know what, I can go to the commission, it will not cost me as much, it wouldn't be as expensive, and the commission is going to investigate and be there to act as a friend if it is that we need to go a step further. Later on in the presentation, he will be talking about the establishment of the commission and also the tribunal. So this is really adding and enhancing what is in the Constitution. So we're sure, and that is not to say that we would always need to improve. I agree with you completely. There are ways that we can enforce, but this is one of those enforcement mechanisms that we're seeing to help.
I don't know how many people here feel that you have been discriminated to a point that you need a commission agents, and a tribunal to look after your affairs. Put up your hand if you need something like that. Put your hand up. 1, 2. You see, this bill is not to protect us. It is to protect a group of people from us. We are the targets of this bill. The commission will come for us, investigate us, and a tribunal is set up, and it is the state. You heard him, he repeat over. He didn't say what arm of the state, you know. He just said the state, the resources of the state will be coming after you. You know, we have a system for discrimination. It is called the courts. Judges, lawyers, trained professionals. They train in the UK, in the Caribbean. They become judges. This is not that. This bill is asking you, the Belizean people, to approve a totally different system. I will be brief because your country, sir, you are an expert, but your country does not have an equal opportunities bill. It may have an equal employment. Nobody in the Caribbean has an equal opportunities bill, inclusive of, you see, they have 18 different discriminations up there. 5 of them are pro-LGBT. 5 of the 18. You see, there have been breastfeeding issues, age issues, pregnancy issues, family issues, a lot of those. They were not interested in a commission for that. I will only speak once, Madam Chair, and I will only speak once. No, a special group originated, and they have paid for and financed this bill from the United Kingdom, Canada, and so we have studied not the existence of this bill, but how it has been used around the world to create a new world order and a new morality. From the beginning of time, morality has been a personal issue. You go to your priest, your pastor, you have a religious conviction about how you are to behave in public life. Look at your paper. The first sentence in the second row tells you that this bill is to control. It didn't say public service. You know about public. That bill doesn't say public service. It says public life. The government, the state, has a morality of its own that it wants to infringe upon the people of Belize, how they behave in the public square. And they do not want to do it through the court. They want a special commission that they will choose with special powers that they will determine, because the act does not say who the commission will be, how often will they change, how will they put together, who will be the tribunal. And I will close with this. Fines are $5,000 and $10,000. You know what is $10,000? It used to be what the courts try people for drug trafficking, cocaine, the worst drugs to affect the country and the mind.
Pastor, I'm
Those
sorry,
are the fees that they will put on us. I reject this bill.
Thanks for your comment. Like we said earlier, we're here to get the views, so thank you very much. 2 things. First of all, equal opportunities legislation does exist in Guyana, St. Lucia, and Trinidad. So that's the first thing. Second of all, the concept of having a commission, as will be presented later in the presentation, it talks about conciliation, which is an alternative dispute resolution, a form of alternative dispute resolution, which is not a concept that is new to Belize. Right now, in the courts, there's court-connected arbitration and mediation. So we are moving away from always having to go to court to seek redress and having opportunities for people to be able to settle their disputes amicably. So I just wanted to touch on those 2 points.
So it's important that I want us to be clear on this, because we come to this discussion with a generosity of spirit, which means that I'm interested in hearing the perspectives fully and engaging with them. Pastor Wade, you spoke of the question of fines, and at the beginning of my presentation, I was clear that the only criminal sanctions that will remain in the bill will be those in relation to victimization, which is not new to Belize. Now, as to the question of Barbados does not have equal opportunities legislation as yet. I don't know if the government has an interest in so doing. What I do know is that Belize has sexual harassment legislation before any other place in the Caribbean did. And other people followed Belize with sexual harassment legislation. And so, CARICOM, in the development of the model bill, as CARICOM has done on labor issues, as CARICOM has done in relation to equal pay, in relation to discrimination against domestic workers, they've agreed to the development of a framework, and the governments of the Caribbean have said, we will engage with this mechanism. We will see how we can make it appropriate for our circumstances. In the absence, what we know is that in the absence of mechanisms, the stubborn levels of poverty have not changed drastically. What we know when we look at the reviews concerning the adequacy of the legal framework by the same bodies established, such as CEDAW, the Convention to Eliminate Discrimination Against Women, it says that there are things that Belize can do to improve its legislative framework. And so it recognizes that. And then again, it's important that we highlight this bill is not attempting to make criminals out of anyone. What it is about, and if you do not experience discrimination, and when we've gone around the country, we've heard stories of discrimination. I say this. There's a story about a man who comes into church dressed in his finest. Rich man, well dressed. And a man who comes who is poor and dressed in filthy clothes. And the question of, if I say to the rich man, have the best seat, and I say to the poor man, sit at my feet, have I not discriminated against him with evil thoughts? So this is what I say here. What's important is that the legislation protect, and I've heard genuine, we engaged with some of the pastors here tonight. I heard concerns about ensuring that people of faith are able to exercise their faith. That people of faith, that in addressing the different ways that people experience discrimination in Belize, that people of faith are not affected, or that there is minimal intrusion. I heard that, and I heard that clearly. And so the legislation includes some of the strongest religious protections possible. But it has to be that I can't not acknowledge that others have said that they have experienced discrimination. We've seen the data. So the same CRPD committee, the same CEDAW, the same CRC, they talk about that discrimination. And so if we can engage on the question of the commission clearly provides for, the legislation provides for the terms of the commission, it provides for the mechanism for the appointment of the commission, and we can engage about that question. Should the church and church parties be able to nominate a person to the commission? That's a fair question. And so it's important that I highlight that the mechanism in the bill already speaks to many of the concerns that were raised as we engage in this process. Next question.
Yes, good night. Thank you for the opportunity. I think it's very interesting that this legislation is the implementation of the gender policy that we fought for so many years. I want to address a few things, Ms. Alpuche. In this legislation, for example, the gentleman just mentioned about the protections for the church. Section 35, I have the law here unless it's wrong. It protects the church from being forced to hire a LGBT member to be a priest or a pastor. But I can't find, you mentioned, young man, earlier, sir, I don't know what your name is, but you mentioned earlier that there is a protection for free speech. So it's not in this legislation I have in my hand. 75 pages and it's not there. Section 35, page 36, it is not there. So, okay, maybe you can clarify on that, but it's not here. So therefore, if you want to protect the preacher from behind the pulpit, what about Brother Joe, who goes out here to the park and tells an homosexual, if you don't change your lifestyle, Jesus Christ loves you, but if you don't change, you're going to burn in hell. So if he tells him that, does this legislation protect me as a non-pastor to tell Johnny Cake or Jane Doe, if you continue your LGBT lifestyle, which is sodomy, which is against the word of God, you will burn in hell? If I tell him that, am I discriminating? My Bible teaches me that. So do I have that right? That's question one. Question two, according to you, what is the meaning of the word sex? In this 75 pages, it says male or female. Is that male or female scientifically, or is it male or female by gender orientation decision? Because if it is scientific, that is great. But that's what the PM thought it meant when this craziness started. But the deal is that we learned that male and female doesn't mean scientific. So if it does not mean scientific, and Paloti has a young man who decides he's a young lady, and he wears skirts, and he wants to go to Paloti, this thing says in the education section, it says that the school is protected and that they don't have to allow a male to go to a female school. But if the person says, I am not a male, I am a female, I wear skirts, can he not sue Paloti because he wears skirts and he said he's a female? So that's question two. I'm going by 75 pages. The other question is, and I'll finish with this one. According to page 18, section 5 of the Act, it says the Act to prevail. According to the country of Belize and the way policies or actual laws are enacted, the new law, when it is enacted, any older legislation is null and void if it contravenes the new law. The only thing that cannot contravene the new law is the Constitution. So therefore, my question is, if Mr. Benjamin didn't misinterpret the Constitution on the meaning of the word sex, and then the Court of Appeals didn't uphold the misinterpretation of the word sex to declare that it means sexual orientation, would we be talking about LGBT? The answer is no. So my proposal to Belizeans is to stop playing red and blue and to tell the red man and the blue man, you're not going to get my vote. You are out of here, because I believe that we need the Constitution to be modified and ratified so that we can tell Benjamin that the Constitution, meaning of the word sex, is what the PM thought it meant, which is male or female. I reject this bill and I reject gender orientation.
So, thank thank you for the question. One of the key things that we've been very clear about is that persons of faith retain their constitutionally protected ability to share the word, their word of truth, of love, that they are able to share that. Now here's where this is found in the legislation. If you turn with me to the harassment provisions, so the harassment provision says that nothing in this legislation affects religious discussion, religious instruction. Now, here's the thing. It doesn't affect, let's be clear. Are you a pastor? I think you said you're a pastor. I listened to you with intent and without response. I can't answer if you are re-answering. So, firstly, the legislation only applies in particular sectors. So only those areas that are regulated. So when you are outside, that is an irrelevant concern to the legislation. The legislation provides that nothing in this act affects religious instruction. Now, why is this important in religious discussion? So you maintain that ability to have that conversation. Now, in the context of the workplace, for example, if you and I share different faith perspectives and we're at work, it might be a little harassing if every time I pass your workspace, I said, well, you worship wrongly. And so there may be times when it is appropriate in work, as we do now. Now, one of the things that I hear a concern about is the law reflecting morality. I hear that. Now, here are the ways in which that the law has addressed morality while allowing the church to be able to do its work and its mission. Now, since 1953, the Married Women's Property Act allowed a woman certain capacity in relation to divorce. Now, I remember there being something about if a man divorces a woman, he makes her a victim of adultery, and a man who marries her also commits adultery. That's permitted in Belize right now, and you are nonetheless permitted to tell any woman, to tell any man that the good book says this is the way, walk thee in it. That's still protected. That's always been protected. The status of children. My brother was the ring bearer at my mother and my father's wedding. That's only possible if he was born out of fornication. The law recognized in Belize, I think Barbados did it first and Belize followed, but it recognized that children, regardless of where they were born, their station, that it was important that the law gave them equal protection. Even though I might be a little better looking than my brother, he should be entitled to the land the same way. And so that didn't change the ability of the church to say that fornication is a sin. I hear you saying that sex outside of God's context, whether that is adultery, whether that is fornication, whether that is sodomy, all of that is sin. But the Belizean state does not always reflect sin, but it allows you to call out sin. Rightfully so. And that's what's important, to be protected. So that you know and you understand yourself as having the good truth. It allows other Belizeans who do not share that perspective for you to have access to them to share the word, but it allows them to exist in public life with dignity. So it is not unusual for positions. And so when we look at, I looked at all of those examples, and there's no criminal provisions in relation to fornication. There's no justification outside of very few contexts where fornication is a significant deciding factor. Now, that was the issue that arose in Maria Roches. And this is understood that in a public authority, it was important that she had protection. Now, we've said that where there is a private religious institution, the church may have greater leverage to engage in that sort of differentiation that is important. And so I just wanted to respond just to highlight the ways in which the position of the state, the government, and particular religious viewpoints have not always coincided, but what has always been protected is the ability of a person of faith to say, this is my truth. I want you to come and walk in this light.
In your presentation earlier, sir, you mentioned that your bill does not seek to criminalize, except in the instance of discrimination.
In the instance of victimization, which is retaliation for the bringing of a complaint, which already exists in the Labor Act and the Sexual Harassment Act.
Can I finish, if you don't mind, please? You said that your legislation prohibits direct, indirect, harassment, and victimization, and under the characteristics, you included people of sexual orientation, which we all in this room know what the meaning of that is. My concern with this bill is that it is way too vague for us. And I want to condemn the way that you guys have put on this so-called consultation, because I think if you guys would have done this in a responsible manner, you mentioned that you're an attorney, you've studied law. It is not a 1 minute sit down to sit and interpret a piece of legislation. Worse, a 75 or 79 page document, which most of us in this room was not privy to, except by a lot of force. We just received it just a couple days ago. And I think that if you guys as a commission would want to be responsible and want to gain the respect of the people in this room, and around this country, let me finish if you don't mind, please. Around this country, you would have made copies of this bill available a long time ago. So back to my comment, you said that under the characteristics that sexual orientation is not allowed to be victimized, and you talked about the direct and indirect interpretation by your committee that you're going to put together. To me, I think that is way too vague for us. And tonight I want to ask if you can kindly explain to us. I don't know if we can really take at heart value what you're saying, because we have been indeed studying what has been happening around the world with the LGBT community and all the rights and privileges that this community has sought after, especially in the United States. And I want to say that prior to President Donald Trump. Prior. And I trust that you guys have seen the last public meeting he had, which was about a week ago. And what he is seeking to do is to reverse most of what the liberal Democrats in the United States seek to accomplish, which to me was blown way out of proportion. People in this room tonight, ladies and gentlemen, are responsible people. And I believe if you guys would have sat with us in a proper consultation and asked us to give our true views on what freedoms, what rights the LGBT community could have had, we could have had a proper conversation. Let me just finish and wrap it up. What I believe, and listen to the presentation, I find it to be very deceptive. Very, very deceptive. Because in the presentation, sir, like I said, please, I would like to ask that you all respect the decency and the level of intelligence of the people in this room. We are informed people. We watch the news. We understand what is happening around the world today. So for you to get up there, sir, and have a presentation where you are talking about people with disability, I felt like closing my ears. Because I do not believe for a minute that that is the real intent of what you guys are seeking to do. I am of the perception that you guys are trying to deceive us. And I think it is true for most of my colleagues in this room. Because I'll tell you, if I'm wrapping up. If President Trump, the head of the world superpower today, is seeking to reverse a lot of the things that the liberal Democrats have accomplished in the United States. Here we are in January 2020, and in Belize, we have come into a situation where we have been stuffed down our throats. A bill that seeks to go against what the majority of the people in this country is desiring. I think what we would have loved to hear, you guys or whoever you want to call upon to create the right legislations to protect the people who are being murdered in this country, who are not getting justice in the courts. Those are the real issues today for us, sir. It's the real issues. And I want to say today, we condemn this consultation because we find it to be very deceptive. It's not professionally done. It's not professionally done. Because we would have gotten a copy before, so we could have a proper conversation around the real issues that you guys are trying to present to us. Thank you.
So I want to respond to some of the legal technical questions. The concept of direct and indirect discrimination currently exists in Belize's constitutional framework. It doesn't add any additional test to the meaning of direct and indirect discrimination, which has been understood and included in all Caribbean Commonwealth constitutions. And secondly, those have been understood as being legally certain. So the judiciary and citizens are able to understand and interpret them with sufficient precision such that it is workable. So where a law is so vague that it cannot be understood or be subject to a range of almost impermissible kind of understandings, then it will be in breach of the rule of law. So I just want to say that this concept of direct and indirect discrimination is not new. Now, I heard the concern about victimization, and this is what this is. This is simply what this is. This isn't direct or indirect discrimination. Victimization is a provision that already exists in the sexual harassment legislation. What does it mean? If a worker says, look, I want to bring a question to the commission. I don't feel as though we can engage, but the commission has some free conciliation services. Maybe we can talk about that. And the next 2 weeks, that person is fired. Or a person of faith who says, look, I want to have this day off. And their employer who is not a person of faith says, look, I don't really need you here. The legislation says that that's victimization and that's what's protected. All that simply is protection in relation to retaliation that allows a person to access the courts. Now, it's important that we highlight that this legislation is not a cure-all. It's important that you continue to hold government to account about issues about the high murder rate. It's important that you engage with government about these issues. What this is in response to is the recognition that there are a variety of indicators that says persons in Belize do not experience equal opportunities in Belize. That's all. Now, I want to just briefly see if we can bridge about what are the areas, are there any areas of agreement? So you may want, for example, limitations in relation to particular characteristics. So you may say an exception should apply in this regard. But is it not possible? Are there certain circumstances where you might agree that it is impermissible or should be impermissible for persons to be discriminated in relation to? Because if this is about, if the starting point of this is constitutional values about kindness, are there any places where you can agree? Is there any way that the work of the Commission can improve the lives of a whole set of Belizeans? I hear a conversation about exceptions, and we can talk about what are the specific areas where A, religious body, or B, a person who's motivated by faith, that they are able to be able to engage with the law consistent with their convictions. We can talk about that, and states do that. I hear you about the quality of consultation. I hear you. The legislation is now available. We provided a simple guide to the legislation that covers in very broad strokes the key provisions so that even if you did not attend Hewitt in law school, etc., that you could have a sense. And if starting with that, then you could ask questions. That 4-page guide is available online. And here's why. The consultation process and dialogue does not end tonight. I'm not sure whether the arrangements have been made, but when I was last here, I spoke with Pastor Wade, Pastor Sturm, Pastor Lewis, and they said, we want further consultation. I said, we will come back in January having moves from the model bill with something that we can consider and discuss in detail. I've asked that I have a meeting with the church or various religious constituencies who may have different viewpoints on different aspects about this legislation. Political victimization is in this legislation because Pastor Wade mentioned it. It is in this legislation because it was recognized that there was a blind spot that we had not engaged in. There are a couple other areas that are still under consideration, such as we spoke about the close in age exception, where we recognize that some children after the age of consent at 16 may be vulnerable to grooming, etc. I heard a concern about children, and we recognize that children are vulnerable. And so we want to engage on that. Let's see where those areas of constructive engagement about the values that you may find common. And see then, where does this umbrella lean? The question then is, should all Belizeans have their umbrella? That's a simple question.
If I can, on the whole issue of the consultation, as Mr. Brathwaite said, and as I said in my opening statement, we got here multiple levels of consultation. And he pointed out that some faith-based leaders have already been consulted within the first 22 stakeholders groups that we talked to. And changes have been made. So now we have a draft that we're going around with that people can look at, and we've tried to make it, as he said, accessible, but it doesn't end here. At the end of this presentation, you will see where we're asking you for your comments and recommendations on how are we going to deal with some of the concerns that you have. And we already have gotten good feedback, and so we want more. We're sitting here expending this money because we're genuinely interested in what people are thinking and how we can improve this so that all our lives improve, so that we all have umbrellas, to use Mr. Brathwaite's. So even beyond that, there will still be up to the end of the month, insofar as the process is concerned for the National AIDS Commission. After we complete all these consultations countrywide, there will still be until the end of the month where people can write in their concerns. There are still other spaces within our legislative process, even if and when the bill is tabled in Parliament. There is this space for the committee hearings that have been used with the Criminal Code amendments. So when this bill goes to the Health and Human Development Committee of Parliament and it holds its hearings, people can come and comment. And people know that process because we've had very healthy input with the Criminal Code, the sexual abuse amendments to the Criminal Code. So it doesn't end here. And we're sitting here, many of us, we've worked all day and come here tonight to genuinely listen with a generosity of spirit. I like that term. To hear what you have to say as Belizeans. So it doesn't end here. And so we would love to hear what are all your comments and your recommendations as how to improve this bill.
Okay. Good evening, Mr. Brathwaite, Ms. Alpoche, and Madam Speaker. I think you feel the sentiments here tonight. I think people in Belmopan are somewhat well versed and informed with all of these agendas and so forth, right? I have two questions. By the way, it's a happy belated Christmas and Happy New Year. This country, we're a Christian country. We just celebrated the birth of the Christ. We're looking at going into the Easter season in the next couple of months. So obviously we celebrated, we call them holy days, which people just get to stay home and relax and do all kinds of stuff with families in celebration of the birth of the Christ and Easter, the resurrection of the Christ. So we all understand that we're a Christian nation. It's also in our preamble that we're a nation under the supremacy of God. And so if that is so, are we off somewhere to be holding strong to religious Christian values and enforcing them also by just standing for what is right? There's a law, and I don't know if it's already gone out of our books, but there's a law that talks about unnatural act. And let me maybe be the first tonight, I guess, to say that the stuff that were presented in the beginning, I don't think we're so very badly discriminated against women being engineers. I mean, I don't know. I think so. I haven't seen it. I think if there are women that are engineers, I think we have respect for them. They could have the same salary as a male. I think so, and in different areas. So I don't think we're so off in those areas. I think we need a little bit, we could do a little bit of adjustment. So there's a lot of good stuff that was presented, Ms. Alpoche, that you started off with, and all the stuff. To be honest, I think that maybe 80% or 85% of them I agree with I agree with it. This is good stuff. I'm talking about discrimination of different. Yeah, I agree with that. That's all good. I think we'd all agree with that. I just feel, I think, like my colleague said, these are only the little things on the surface. So the main thing, we're trying to cover that up, and we're not going directly to the issues that are real concern to us, particularly as clergy people. Let me ask two very important questions. Yeah, technology, you see. There was one of the things up there that said we have direct and indirect discrimination. So I'll keep it very brief because I know we've been stretching out, and I appreciate you guys taking after a long day work, being here late with us. I appreciate that. So I understand you need to get home also, right? This was first question. I will read from a scripture. It says, therefore God also gave them up to uncleanness in the lust of their hearts, to dishonor their bodies among themselves, who exchanged the truth of God for the lie, and worship and serve the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. For this reason God gave them up to vile passions, for even their women exchanged the natural use for what is against nature. Likewise also the men, leaving the natural use of the woman, burn in their lust for one another, men with men, committing what is shameful, and receiving in themselves the penalty of their error, which was due. That is one question, sir, that I would like you to answer. Is that a direct discrimination or indirect discrimination? And then the next question is, because while I think everybody here, and I think if everybody will join with me and stand up, if you reject the bill, you would stand up, and so that we could have our panel understand what we're talking about. You reject this bill. Now, like I said, there is some good stuff in the bill. There's some good stuff in the bill. We all agree with the good stuff in the bill. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Now, my next question, sir. I have two questions. I have two questions, sir. I have two questions. You talk a lot here this evening, sir. Please.
Those were two. This gentleman has been here.
Listen, I have two questions here. Listen. My next question is this. If we decide tonight, remove everything that deals with a gay lifestyle, homosexual lifestyle, you remove everything like that, and we will say amen to the bill. Would you agree with that? Thank you, sir.
So to the first question in relation to whether scripture is discrimination, your religious perspective is protected in relation to every person here who believes that unnatural offenses, as were in the criminal code, is sin. You are absolutely protected in your ability to believe that and to follow that in your own lives. Firstly. Secondly, what we've spoken about in relation to the ways in which, for example, the law permits fornication, the law permits adultery, the law permits a whole range of conduct that is not scriptural. And here's why. Now, when the Constitution talks about the supremacy of God, is that your God? Is that the way in which Mayans engage with God in their traditional religion, Garifuna, etc.? So it is that where persons have Christian, there are multiple denominations. There are persons who are not Christians. Now, a quick question here about, I've seen the stories of persecution of Christians. Places where the laws of the land are a different religion and Christians are not able to live and to be able to share their truth. That is protected in Belize. Now, here's why. If it is that you are concerned about persecution of your Christian brothers elsewhere because of theocracy, if you're concerned about that, then in the reverse, you also have to be concerned about persons who do not share your perspective and the extent to which they can have protection. What is absolutely important is that on Sunday through Saturday, because I sense that there are lots of people of faith here, is that you are able to pray for persons who you think, according to the good book, are sinning. You're able to pray for them, you're able to engage with them. That is not affected. But here's the thing, and if I can really quickly, because I come into this gentleman. If we think about, it's possible if we adopted the framework that law must criminalize sin. There was use for Rahab. There was use for Rahab. It wasn't against the law, but it was sin. And so that all certainly for me, from a position of faith, is that the law is saying some people, in the absence of this mechanism, will be weak. They may be at the feet, as we spoke about earlier. If we use, and this isn't, I'm not trying to change anyone's theological position here. Speaking from within faith for me, and when we talk about the constitutional values, very quickly, I'll finish this response with this story. When the woman who was caught in adultery was brought into the temple, they said, kill her, she has sinned. Yeah, kill her, she has sinned. And it must have been a nonsense to see Jesus just writing in the dust. And they're saying, but this woman has sinned, kill her. No, he doesn't look up. He stays looking down. And then he looks up and it is only her. And he asks, where's your accusers? Now what was written there was, let him who is without sin cast the first stone. Now here's what that did. Here's what that did. It protected her from harm. And here's where you come in. Here's where you come in. We're coming to sin no more. Pastor, it is important that you can say, go and sin no more. But the state, the government, that's not the role of the government. That's the role of the church. And so it's important that as you are convicted of your convictions, that you share that. But to provide that protection is where the bill is oriented in terms of a value.
Hello. Rashad, I think you would want to be in Belize longer for you to appreciate our culture, our values, and our values. I would want to associate myself with the presentation from the previous speakers. I'm not sure about the panel, but the previous speakers were dynamic. I want to request for CEO and Randall to stand up because I want to address both of you. Okay, if you don't want to, then I will still address both of you. I think most of us appreciate the opportunity to be here tonight and for you all to give a brief synopsis of this bill. And most of us appreciate it because if it weren't for this opportunity, then we wouldn't have a chance to give our contributions towards the bill. So I applaud you all for that. In your opening remarks and in your recent remarks, you had said that NAC had consulted the stakeholders and interest groups, including the unions. I would want to stand corrected, or maybe correct you, to say that, and I am not here representing the unions. However, I would want to tell you that recently I was a member of the executive of the National Trade Union Congress, and I was also a member on the Council of Management for Public Service Union. And I could tell each and every one of you here that the union has not been consulted. To add to that, only recently the unions had received an invitation from NAC so that this presentation could be conducted. Is it tomorrow or the 21st? The 21st. Okay? So we would want to be truthful to the people. Right? Secondly, Mr. Shepherd Randall had, I don't know if he had corrected or intended to correct Pastor Wade when he said that this bill does not exist in our Caribbean jurisdiction, and you had cited several countries, including Guyana. In my brief research, and I also stand corrected, Trinidad has an equal employment bill, act. Guyana does not have an equal opportunity act. Guyana has an equal employment act. Barbados doesn't have an equal opportunity act nor bill. They have an equal employment act. You could check, any one of us who have internet, we could Google it. No, I'm not finished yet. Just let me continue. I would also want to request that, or advise, and my advice comes because I am noting, and we could note, that government representatives are the leading interest groups in this bill. In fact, you all are the ones who are doing the consultations. And if it weren't for you all, if it weren't for NAC, then this would mean that the National Assembly would have had the opportunity to pass the bill through all its stages. Outside of that, they would have introduced the bill, referred to I think it's a Human Development Standing Committee of the House of Representatives. And so that bill would then meet in the chambers of the National Assembly, and not in the chambers, there's a conference room that only hosts about 20 people. Okay? So now, what would I recommend? that when we go back to cabinet, since you had indicated that cabinet had mandated not to take on this ridiculous bill, in my view, is to advise them that we take this bill to a referendum. So, I'm saying that because sometimes we find that we have some of these controversial bills that goes to the House, and it just goes through all its stages, and the people doesn't have any chance to give meaningful recommendations to the committees that they are being referred to. I'm sure Madam President would take that to as the Speaker to her colleagues and the CEO to her CEO colleagues. And I also trust that I don't know if you have secretaries that are taking notes, because some very, very important contributions are being made here tonight, and we wouldn't want for them. And just another observation, yes, I take it very worrisome to see that you all did not expect the number of people that showed up tonight, right? And the capital of the nation, indeed. So you would also want to say that the church brought out a huge crusade out here. I'd also want to remind you that I am not here with any church group. I am here as a Belizean with concern. Okay? And so I would like to ask everyone out here, do we agree with this bill? Okay. In closing, I do want to say that the bill does have some good intentions in trying to address some very serious issues that is impacting Belize. I don't think that Belize is ready for an LGBT movement, and I'll tell you why. The CEO had said earlier in her presentation that Belize is only about 370 thousands living here. And so if we move into our LGBT business, it means that that population will never grow. Belize is a developing country in the Caribbean and in Central America. Let me continue, please, because I am closing. If you stop me, I'll continue more.
I'm sorry, Pastor Sturm, are you waiting for yes, we will
yes,
pass the mic.
Pastor Sturm said I could go ahead.
We are going to pass the mic to Pastor Sturm.
Allow me to close, brother. You said that we will be respectful. No, we are talking about being respectful.
If you're
Thank you very much, sir.
One minute,
thank you
sir.
very much, and I continue to respect the efforts
One minute, sir.
of this commission.
Recall there were some ground rules, and so indeed we will ask you to really wrap up because there are other people who want to comment.
Sure,
yeah?
Thank you very much. And so I am closing. I was saying that our population is very small and we are a developing nation. Remember that when we were trying to gain independence, we had to increase our population. Please, man, for God's sake, make we entertain procreation. I do not accept this bill.
While we're transitioning the mic, let me just address one thing that you raised upon. Yes, indeed, Mr. Brathwaite is telling me that indeed they did not get a chance to consult with the unions. There were 22 stakeholders, groups, and indeed. So it is not my attempt to deceive anybody. I was fact-checked and I accept that. I have no problem with it because I have no reason to deceive. So
just by way of update in relation to trade unions. When I was here in both August and in November into December, we had asked for meetings with the trade unions. We were not at the time in December able to facilitate that. I said on my return, as I did say in relation to the church and other groups, that we wish to meet with them. And so that's where the very recent request for engagement with the unions, because ultimately this is about engaging with your views. Now, very quickly, if we can, I want to very briefly engage on a technical question. Trinidad has an Equal Opportunities Act that regulates not only employment, but services, accommodation, etc. Guyana has a Prevention of Discrimination Act, which has the same content. So it rolls by any other name, as it were. So that's to say that there are varying names to these enactments. In South Africa, it is called the PAPUDA, the Promotion of Equality, and the Prevention of Unfair Discrimination Act. They're called different things. But ultimately, as a question of fact, Guyana has the Prevention of Discrimination Act, Trinidad has the Equal Opportunities Act. And we can engage, and what's important here is we can engage on the question of if there's 85% of the bill that you are in favor of, is it possible that you can agree that a person who is renting a house from a rental agent should not be discriminated against because they are gay, for example? Can you agree that in accommodation, that shouldn't be relevant? If you agree, if in education, if you can agree that if a student is pregnant, that child has a right to education, then tell us that child should be protected under the Equal Opportunities legislation. So work through with it. No, we know the data that girls who are pregnant are removed from school. We know this. And so all I'm saying, sister, I see you. All I'm saying is we can work through. So if you want to do a provision by provision markup, then we can do that. The point of this is that we start with telling you what is in the bill. Because if we just gave you the bill, you would say, this is not friendly for me to read. And here we are talking, and the process will continue. Pastor Stern.
Good evening, everyone. Okay, my question is in reference to section 42, subsection 2, and subsection B, where it states, and I'll read what this section 42 states: a person shall not discriminate against another person by harassing that other person. And it then states, a person discriminates against another person by harassing that person if, in subsection B, the conduct has the purpose or effect of creating an intimidating, hostile, degrading, humiliating, or offensive environment for that person. Offensive. What is deemed to be offensive? How do you assess that that is a legitimate offense? Now, in section 44, it says, a person shall not publish or display or cause or permit to be published or displayed an advertisement or notice that indicates or could reasonably be understood as indicating an intention by that person to do an act that is prohibited under this act. And if we go down, it even states that there's a fine of $5,000, and then further down, it speaks about advertisement. Can this be clarified? How does this relate to an institution, for example, a religious institution that may want to advertise for a post that may require that the person is in the same belief or accepts the belief of that religious institution? So there is where my question is. And further to that, the jargons that are throughout the bill include jargons such as sexual orientation, gender identity, and any other. And my concern there is, what exactly do you consider sexual orientation? Will it be listed or will it be free range? The same goes for gender identity and the term any other. So here, I just want to state, after you clarify this, that as a Belizean, I would have hoped that the minister would be here today that is pushing this bill, and I would have loved to ask him to clarify this, because he should be well versed of what this bill is stating and what he is promoting for the people that had voted him in, who he is representing, and state that this is a deceitful bill if it is pushed with those jargons.
Thank you.
It is also a free range if it is pushed and passed in the House. It is free range for a hidden agenda. I reject this bill.
Thank you very much. So I'll respond to the technical questions. At the beginning of my presentation, I highlighted in relation to advertisement that any criminal provisions that you see in the bill, with the exception of victimization, are to be removed. The legislation clearly provides both a justification and an exemptions framework. So it is not prohibited. There will be circumstances where it is not prohibited. If there's a private religious educational institution, this is different from a public authority where the constitutional law on this issue is relatively clear. If it is that there is a private religious educational institution, there is no discrimination in saying, I require a Catholic or an evangelical, an Anglican to work in this position. That would not be discrimination, because the legislation firstly provides an exception for inherent requirements. And then secondly, the legislation provides, and we can strengthen the language to say that nothing that is done by an educational body that is provided by a religious body that is a private entity is affected in that relation.
private, meaning that there are no taxes?
I have a very short question. I want to try to make it really short. The Constitution starts with, whereas the people of Belize, I am a born Belizean by the way, affirm that the nation of Belize shall be founded upon principles which acknowledge the supremacy of God. Now, I have a question here. So if I feel someone discriminates against me in my work, I believe in the supremacy of God, and I believe that I should go and seek out how I should use my brains and what I have to go and find some other work. That is what a free market would be without the government telling me what to do. My question is, it says here in this bill, I read the bill today and yesterday, it says that this supersedes all other laws except the Constitution. So if this is what the Constitution says, that it should be based on the Bible, and the Bible principles are that if someone has done something wrong, there are laws to punish them. Done something wrong, not thought something wrong, done something wrong. Then how does this bill work together with that? From what I see, this concept does not come from the Bible that we regulate people's thoughts. So that is my question. How does that work together with being from a biblical perspective? Thank you.
So I think we partially covered this question a little earlier in relation to when we talk about in a multi-ethnic, multi-faith, multi-denominational perspective, it's important that the government / the state and religious perspectives then need not necessarily align, but they must permit you to enjoy your perspective. Now, in relation to, just very quickly, we've already spoken about cases, adultery, fornication, that is not criminalized, and this bill is not is not in relation to the criminalization of any conduct. So this bill is not addressing questions of criminal sexual activity, whether in favor or against it. This bill doesn't address that.
Good evening. Thank you very much. I want to say that I think for the majority of all of us, if not all of us, we share the compassionate position that you put out, Ms. Alpuche, about we don't want to see anybody discriminated against. When we stand up and say we're opposed to this, that's not because we're pushing for discriminating people. I think the majority of the people in this room are smart enough to see how anti-discrimination legislation in other countries has been used either to silence those that are opposed to whether it's LGBT or other areas, but also there has been a specific targeting from LGBT to faith-based businesses. And I would say with the commission that would be set up, you know, do we here have the confidence in what the makeup of that commission would be when this has been crafted together with Caleb Orozco and Unibom and Human Dignity Trust and all of that? And is the commission going to be stacked? Okay, is the tribunal going to be stacked? Is an agenda together with this? That's the question that people feel. We're smart enough. There's hundreds of news stories where anti-discrimination legislation has been used to silence the church. And quick question here. On these 18 points of protected characteristics, it lists lawful religious belief. The first question that popped in people's minds is, what does that mean? And is there going to be an unlawful religious belief? I think I know what it means, but I would like to ask for that to be clarified in terms of lawful religious belief.
So I sense that you may have a series of questions, so we can do...
I've got a couple shorties.
A question answer. So lawful religious belief, there are practices that are condoned within varying religions that do not receive acceptance now. So there's some conduct that persons may believe within a religious tradition that are not necessarily allowed already. So persons may have particular views about how divorce should be done. Persons may have views about child marriage. The issue of the regulation of child marriage, for example, that's a cultural/religious question. But the state has intervened to say, look, in a society, this is not conduct that we can engage within as Belizeans. And so that's simply it.
So my point is, I think that needs to be clarified in the legislation, what that means by lawful religious belief, right? Also, I noted with great alarm in the legislation that for a student to be expelled from school is discrimination, correct? That's what it says.
It may be.
It says it clearly.
So here's what the legislation provides. The legislation provides prohibited behavior or regulated behavior in a specific area. So it says that it is possible that the expulsion of a student could be discrimination, except if there is an applicable exception. So we can't read a single provision because the legislation is integrated. So if, for example, a student has engaged in an act of violence that causes harm to another student, it's possible that that could be a good reason to expel that student. It might be a different question in a public institution, the question of when a student could be sent home. Yeah? So very quickly, the tribunal will be a judge of the High Court. There's no new expansion of the judiciary in that regard. And you see that one of the concerns that we spoke with you about was the possibility of the politicization of the tribunal, of the commission. And so the framework that was engaged, if you look at the bill, is that there are multiple stakeholders, so the Chamber of Commerce, the bar, etc. Now we'd be interested in hearing, is there another arrangement that might give the Governor General a list of stakeholders to engage with that might better protect the various interests that people may have in wanting to contribute to who are the persons. Something that's not currently reflected is the qualifications in terms of the area of work. So areas that are relevant to the function of the commission, which would have been the CARICOM model bill, which you would have seen previously.
Okay, and then my final point, the religious exemption that's listed in here, we've gone through this, our attorneys have gone through this. We just got this Saturday morning, 75 pages of legalese. The religious exemption, if it's supposed to do what you're saying it's supposed to do, I believe that it is severely, severely weak. And
is this the exception or the exemption?
Well, there's a whole section that's called exemptions, okay? And so we're not necessarily concerned about the government intervening in ordinations and all that. We have that religious protection already, okay? But 3 words, when somebody is talking with somebody, and I'm citing this because of news stories, when somebody says to another person, homosexuality is sin, all right? They've just crossed over the line of hate speech, of discrimination. I felt victimized by this person. They go to the commission. This thing goes through because somebody just said what the Bible says in a loving way, not mean, not harsh. And so I'm saying the religious exemptions and exceptions, I believe, if it's wanting to do what you're saying that it's doing, that's not what I saw in the legislation. I don't believe that that's what our attorneys saw either.
There are 2 technical questions on this. So there's first the specific religious exceptions, then there are the general exceptions. So the legislation provides that if there's a legitimate aim, and one of the factors that's included specifically is the need to protect a right such as freedom of religion or freedom of expression. So in the general exception, if there's a legitimate aim, that's connected to a mechanism to achieve that aim, there are a range of factors the court is assessing. One of the key factors is the extent to which it provides, it is related to the protection of a right that is protected under the Constitution. Now, I want to be very, very clear, because what we sought to do, having engaged with you, and a lot of these concerns stem largely from the US experience. I've seen the story of the Toronto pastor. This legislation does not do that. and is clear about that. There are a couple more slides that perhaps the night is spent, but it's important that we briefly go through in relation to what are the fears that we've seen about what's called hate crimes. And I hope that in going through that, we can comfort persons like yourself that you are free, absolutely free, to continue to share your message. Now, already, there are restrictions that exist in relation to the conduct of religious expression. So, for example, you may need a permit in order to preach a particular place. That's accepted as part of government life. But ultimately, the legislation has been really, really clear, except in particular circumstances. So it may matter, for example. I'll let you ask your last question.
So my final point, what I'm seeing as I'm listening here, as I read through the legislation, in the workplace, in the business place, you have a business, you have 10 people working in the office, you're doing customer service over the front counter. Your men wear khaki pants with blue shirts, that's the uniform, and the ladies wear a blue dress. And one of your workers, you didn't know that he was LGBT, and finally he decides to come out, and he wants to show up at work with makeup on, earrings, and wants to wear the dress, and he wants to do the customer service up at the front. And the employer says, wait, you're freaking out our customers, you're disrupting, no, we're not gonna do this, right? And so is that discriminatory according to this law? Yes. I believe the answer is yes.
So, the thing that I didn't cover just now was the exemptions framework. The exemptions framework, that's where in relation to a particular provision, an entity may be able to seek an exemption. So you may say, in my business, I'm making a notice for application that in relation to this protected characteristic, it does not apply in relation to this business. Now, subject to solely the requirements of equal protection of the Constitution Clause, that's solely where that question of the exemption comes in. Now, this may vary, this might matter, there might be a difference in the context of the public service. There may be, so one of the questions that I'm hearing is, should we be differentiating in public service? Because if that is a qualified individual, etc., then perhaps the state engages with them on the basis of their qualification. When we engage, as to the question of the accountant, I heard you say that maybe that's not necessarily relevant to the question of qualification and the job. And so I'm trying to make this...
But in a faith-based school, it's very relevant. I don't see those exemptions in here.
That's where
we gave 18 very specific protected characteristics. I would like to see at least 15 very specific examples or exemptions.
That's where the inherent requirements come in. And so what we can do is to spell out all of those. The purpose for the general justification provision is that otherwise this legislation would be 200 pages. And so I hear you. I'm suggesting to you that the inherent requirements can provide some protections in that regard. And so in private religious education, for example, we can strengthen the language around that. I hear that, and I hear engagement with the leadership that that's a fair area, consistent with the constitutional right. In right to freedom of religion, it talks about the ability of religious institutions to have educational institutions of their own choice.
Because I'm not sure about everybody else, but what I hear in this is litigate, 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 litigate. So.
All right, so very, very quickly, Pastor Lewis, if you can allow me, I just want to run through 3 or 4 more slides very quickly so that you can fairly say that you have gotten everything and then come back to you very, very quickly.
I can't allow you.
Pardon?
You said if I can allow you, and I said I can't.
Please. Just give me 5 minutes. Just give me 5 minutes.
My point is very, very short. Let me go through. You had said that I want to thank you for allowing so many persons to stand up and speak. I don't think you did it in the other forums. So I want to commend you. Give him a hand.
Pastor, again, if I can very quickly, I've said that I come to this with a generosity of spirit. In San Pedro, we had small numbers, but no person was stopped from asking a question. We stopped in San Ignacio when there were no more questions. And I stuck around and I spoke to people who had questions. I spoke to varying persons. I was there almost half hour, 45 minutes later. And so we have been very clear, very, very clear about allowing questions to be asked. And tonight is no different.
No. You said that churches were exempted. When I preach, I expect the members of the church to follow the guidelines of Scripture. So if they are employers and they decide not to engage or take on homosexuals, they will be coming under the law. They'll be under the new regime or whatever, which we don't want to see happen in Belize. If they're from my church and I preach to them, then I expect them to follow the instructions. So they go to work or they go to their business place and they decide, well, I'm not going to take on so-and-so. And I also, as a pastor and my denomination, we decide that we will not marry a gay person. I am a Christian, I'm a religious relief person. What will happen if I don't agree? What will happen if I don't agree to do this? Because this is what is happening around the world, and they are following the pattern. And if I decide against marrying gays,
not this law,
because one of the lawyers said the next step is marriage.
This law does not in any way touch and concern marriage. The definition of marriage, as in Belizean legislation, is not affected by this law any at all. What we can perhaps strengthen is that discrimination in relation to marital status is in accordance with the laws of Belize. That's not affected. And
you're sure?
Absolutely sure. Absolutely sure that this law does not affect that.
But you have moved section 53 to mean sexual orientation.
This law is not related to that. So we can talk about different things at different times, but this law is not in relation to marriage at all.
But we don't believe you, and so we will reject it. We don't want to go any further. But we don't believe that is where it will stop. It will go on and on to allow for gay marriages, although you're saying something different. But anyway, the next point is about education. As a denominational group, we have to sometimes punish people at a great level. So we have the prerogative to do that, to decide that we won't take certain students. We have the prerogative to decide that we will expel a student because they have infringed on the rules. We have the authority to say, well, you have to, the dress code has to be so and so. Do we have that authority in this legislation? Is that giving us the authority? Who has the authority, the church or the commission? And in education, who will have the authority, the Teachers Services Commission or the commission?
So this legislation is not changing the law in relation to schools that are public authorities. That's very clearly settled law.
That are public or private?
Public authorities. So what grant-aided schools, etc., that's already settled by the Maria Rocha's case. Yeah? When we spoke, we said, if a religious organization wishes to leave the church-state partnership and to provide education...
Hold on, sorry. Church-state partnership has existed in Belize for quite a while. What do you mean by leaving?
No. So if it is not funded by the government, when we spoke...
Yes.
All right, so just so everybody can be heard, it's a little distracting with the den. When we spoke, you said, all right, I may disagree with it, but I accept that the law is what it is now in relation to schools that are public authorities, meaning that they're grant-aided school, the state pays for the salaries of the teachers, state covers some of the expenses of children, etc. That's settled law. That's not affected by this. What we've said in creating an exemption for this is that private religious educational institutions, so when we say private, meaning not state-funded, that they have a latitude to make those determinations. Now, when we spoke earlier about the Convention on the Rights of the Child, there may be some circumstances when protection of children may be engaged as a result of those obligations. And so that's a balancing exercise there. It might be, is this a proportionate penalty? But ultimately, in private religious educational institution, this legislation would provide greater protection for religious institutions.
So we can do what we want under our religious group.
What the law is now is that if you are state funded, there are rules and regulations consistent with the Constitution. So if we remember the case of Maria Roches, it was important that some protection was afforded. What we're saying here is that this legislation will not affect private religious educational institutions subject to any particular convention rights. That's it.
So precedent has been set.
The law is settled on that.
Okay. Thanks.
All right, so very, very quickly, please allow me 5 minutes. I am very, very appreciative of the time that you have stayed here. I'm sure that Pastor Storm and Pastor Wade are familiar that after this I will need to wrap my throat for a little bit, drink some hot water and honey. All right, cool. Let's go through this for 5 minutes, and then after we will have a few more questions. All right. So, HIV, the legislation relates to the prevention of HIV care. So the legislation prohibits screening for HIV in employment because it is recognized that that's not a relevant consideration and results in discrimination against people living with HIV. So you know that the Labor Act requires a medical. This makes it clear that the medical does not include an HIV test. Secondly, we know that it is not uncommon for persons to fear that when they go to the doctor or to whoever, their medical information may be by their house before they get back to their house. And so the legislation establishes a duty of confidentiality for health practitioners and other persons who would have access. Can we please just have it a little quiet so that we can finish? Please. We'll just run through this very quickly. Right. So sanctions for breaches of confidentiality, those duties are established, and if they're breached, there are therefore penalties. It's important as a mechanism to ensure that when people go to the doctor, they feel as though their information is safe and that they can access medical care safely. We've highlighted that 50% of people living with HIV who have been diagnosed are not taking their medication for a variety of reasons. Secondly, we know that the legislation currently allows for age of sexual consent is 16. We know, and we've heard in consultation with you, that children are having sex younger than that. We're not lowering the age of consent. What we are saying is that when a child has sex and is unable to access a doctor, that's 2 years of risk of HIV transmission, and the data tells us that that makes them vulnerable to HIV. And so they're able, if you're legally able to have sex, it's important that you be able to access medical care. And you remain free to speak with young people and tell them this is not appropriate. You remain free to tell young people about fornication, etc., but the law says that if it is that you are engaged in sex, that you can be responsible about that. At the age of 16, the age of sexual consent does not require parental consent, and so requiring parental consent, what we know is that that limits or it restricts persons over 16 from going to the doctor. So what's important is that that relationship between parents is maintained, because if the child didn't tell a parent when they had sex, they're not going to tell the parent about going to the doctor. And so the law only covers HIV testing and testing for sexually transmitted diseases and infection. It doesn't cover anything else. We're very clear on that. All right, so we can skip this. The Equal Opportunities Commission, we briefly covered how it will be established, some of its powers, the tribunal. Ultimately, we're looking at civil offenses. We're trying to ensure that this is not based on a litigation framework. And so alternative dispute resolution is an important part of that discussion. And then finally, it's about focusing on preventing breaches and addressing systemic causes of inequality. So those are some of the powers of the Equal Opportunities Tribunal. To review the decisions of the Commission, the tribunal will be staffed by a judge, a High Court judge. So there's no stacking of the tribunal, if you will. There's special measures for the protection of witnesses. So what do we mean by that? There are circumstances where anonymity might be required. So if you're making a complaint, pastors, if a person is making an allegation about sexual harassment, if they're making an allegation about discrimination in relation to HIV, they very well may need to be anonymous in order to feel comfortable in accessing the commission or the tribunal. So I heard lots of concerns about hate crimes. What are hate crimes? Hate crimes are crimes which are motivated by or demonstrate prejudice towards particular features of a victim's identity. So they harm the victim and the community. So if I make a threat, if ultimately I expose a person to violence on the basis that you're a person of faith. So if evangelicals started to be attacked, when you leave home having heard of Sister Jane's attack because of her faith, and then Sister Mary, there is a fear that that then is going to affect you. So you're more concerned about your safety when you leave. Now, what's important about this? The bill does not create any new crimes. I'm not sure if anyone here has the intention to assault, to rob, to murder, etc. It does not create any new crimes, absolutely none. All it does is that it allows criminal activity, if aggravated by prejudice, to be charged and recorded in a way that reflects that, simply. So there are no hate speech offenses. That's important. There are no hate speech offenses because ultimately we are very much interested in the protection of freedom of expression. There exists already in the criminal code very few circumstances where there is prohibited speech. So there's a classic case of if I stood in this room and I shouted fire, fire, and it resulted in a stampede that caused death, that's regulated speech. It also recognizes that if a person makes threats of death or grievous harm, that's an offense. That's already what the law is. And so if and when you hear persons making threats of grievous harm, know that there is an offense that exists in the criminal code already. So there's nothing new there. If you are concerned about your ability to rob or to assault, then that's a different consideration. Amendments to other legislation. So it'll cover it will address the Immigration Act consistent with the decision of the CCJ in relation to prohibited immigrants. The Labor Act, we've covered the importance of making sure that the medical screening does not include HIV testing. The Children and Families Act, so that persons over the age of 16 can access testing for HIV, for other sexually transmitted diseases, because it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense for a person to be able to access HIV testing, but not to access any of the other treatments or testing in relation to other STDs. That's all that does. And then finally, the Sexual Harassment Act is brought under the jurisdiction of the Equal Opportunities Commission and the Equal Opportunities Tribunal. Back to questions. So, it is now 10:10. The two gentlemen here.
Good night. Mr. Bradwick, thanks for the explanation. And from I got here, I keep hearing the word exception, exemption, and I feel very unshaky about those words. In business, you roll out a new service, you give discounts, you give a period where you allow those or those adjustments to kind of roll out. But when is the end point? At what point those exemptions kind of go away? And even as you were explaining, I feel very unshaky because also who's in the seat determines, to me, from what I'm perceiving, who's in the seat determines how those exemptions are weighed, and it feels very unshaky. It doesn't feel like a concrete law that I can put confidence in. So my question is, this exemption, how long will this extend? At what point will this come to an end?
The exceptions framework as applies, for example, in the Labor Code, as applies in relation to other legislation, including the Constitution, those exceptions and exemptions are included in the legislation, and unless repealed, they continue to be effective, as does the Sexual Harassment legislation, the Labor Act, the Married Women with Properties Act, etc. What I'm hearing you say is that you want more detail about the guidelines. So how this ordinarily works is that this framework, this exemptions framework, the Commission, working with stakeholders, will specify further criteria in relation to the guidelines so that we can have greater clarity. So I'm hearing you say that I want to see some more details about the exemptions framework. And that's a helpful and constructive engagement that we can work with. So that I take your point, and that's something that we've noted for inclusion.
Thank you very much. If I can address you, Mr. Bradwick, why we are against this legislation is because this legislation seeks to fundamentally change beliefs, fundamentally change our culture. It's easy for you to come here and try to sugarcoat this so that it sounds good and we can swallow it and say the legislation is okay. But 5 years from now and 10 years from now, we have to live with the reality of what this legislation will mean. Nobody will say, well, Mr. Bradwick didn't say it would be like this. Nobody will care what you said tonight. What matters is what is written in the bill and what that means for Belize. People will use this legislation to lobby for gay marriage. They will say, if I can't marry whom I want, I am being discriminated against. They will say, if I can't go to school dressed as a transgender, I am being discriminated against. They will say, if I want this bakery to make a cake for my gay wedding, and they say no, they're discriminating against me. They will say, if I want this church band to play at my gay wedding, and they say no, that's discrimination. I can take them to court. They will say, if I want my son to use the female bathroom, nobody can say no. And it won't matter what Mr. Bradwick says tonight. You make it sound good. You make it sound like this is about maternity, this is about AIDS and HIV, this is about, what happens in the workplace and all of this. But we know, because of what we see around the world happening, that this legislation is to promote LGBT agenda, and we are the ones who will have to live with that, regardless
regardless of what you say, I'm telling you, 5 years, 10 years down the road, nobody will go back to their notes and say, Mr. Badrick said it wouldn't work this way. That's right. It won't go by that. It will go by what the bill says. And we will have to face people in court because we do not want them to impose their personal lifestyle on us. This is what it will amount to, and this is why we reject this bill.
Thank you. There's one thing you said that I do agree with, and it is to change a culture of discrimination that exists in our country. In any event, I want to thank you for coming. This has been a very important conversation for us. We expected your questions, we expected the reaction, and we know that this would have been primarily members from NIAB. And so we thank you for coming forward. It adds to the conversation, and I think next week it will feed into the conversation, the small group discussion that we will have arranged with the pastors. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. I think that I want to ask you.
Excuse me.
We're closing it. I'm closing it off. I want to thank you for coming, and kindly write in your comments to the National AIDS Commission. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, panel. Thank you very much. I'd like to speak to the people of Belize and the natives of Belmopan. Thank you very much. Yes, how you doing? So I'm a victim of discrimination, everyday discrimination. I'm a victim of everyday discrimination. And I'm thankful for the opportunity to speak tonight. Right? Yes, I got a I was supposed to be naive or ignorant to the law. This officer drew his weapon on me, threatened my life, and told me I'm not in America, and I'm discriminated against every day. I would like to share something with you guys.
Coming close.
Right?
Coming close.
So I believe if we continue to model our government and constitution designed by American influence, which was a fragmented government constructed to benefit the freedom of capital and not the freedom of the people, we will see crystal meth in our communities. And this is a different kind of devil. If we continue to follow the influence of American government, we will see a different devil, a breed of zombies in our streets. Never mind HIV.